Wonderful. Thank you all for being here to hear them. You are in for a treat, as Tom said, and I've listened to bits and pieces of the practicing in my house, and I know that they've been practicing at the Calos house too, so I'm really looking forward to hearing the whole presentation. You know that this series began more than 20 years ago with Mary Calos, who is one of our guests today. She's the grandmother of Ariana. And when Mary was ready to hand off the torch, she gave it to my mother, the grandmother of John. And she carried it for many years, and when she passed away, I took over. So I'm very pleased to be here in her shoes. So thank you again for coming. So today, I have actual bios from these two. I had to write my own before about them. So, Ari Calos is a graduate student in the Architectural History and Historic Preservation program at UVA. Before coming to UVA, she attended Pratt Institute, where she studied art history. Currently, she is working for the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, where she is assisting with historic properties damaged in Hurricanes Michael and Florence that have received grant funding for restoration. She is also in the process of writing her master's thesis on the Main Street program in Virginia, focusing on the cities of Hopewell, Danville, and Stanton. John Eliades was born and raised in Hopewell, Virginia. He's a graduate of Hopewell High School and Randolph-Macon College. He has a passion for discovering, sharing, and preserving local history. Since graduating college, he has returned home to Hopewell, where he works for Waste Management. And just a little incidental, if you've seen the Memories of Hopewell page on Facebook, that was started by John. So I'm very proud to introduce two wonderful people, Ari Calos and John Eliades.
Thanks, Mom, for the nice introduction again. We're really glad to be here for the third year in a row. We always enjoy researching and collecting information about Hopewell and sharing it with you all, so thanks for being here. Secondly, I would just like to add the paper and pen is not for you to take notes, but rather for you, if you have any war stories, Hopewell history, anything that you know that should be investigated or needs to be documented, please write it down. If something jogs your memory during this presentation, please write it down. We'd love to read it and go further into detail some other time. But we also would like to preface this by saying these are not all of the war stories and heroes of Hopewell, Virginia. It's just a small amount that fit into 1 hour, so just want to let you all know that.
Yes, thank you so much, Mrs. Eliades, for the nice introduction. How am I doing on sound, by the way? Can everyone? Thank you so much. Okay. I like wearing the headset. My dad told me I looked like Britney Spears, so I'll take that. But yes, as John mentioned, this is just a glimpse into Hopewell's war stories and heroes, and spanning from the Revolutionary War to World War II. We actually changed the title of the presentation from The War Stories and Heroes of Hopewell to War Stories and Heroes, just to allude to the fact that this is not everything and that there is more to come. So with that said, I wanted to provide a little bit of background about our presentation mode, which will hopefully return here in a second. But we decided to go with something called a story map rather than the typical PowerPoint. And this was something that I learned about in school this past year, and it's essentially a very user-friendly sort of map and geography-based website builder. And it's produced by a company that some of you all might be familiar with, known as Esri. And Esri are the leaders in geographic information systems, or GIS, which is basically the major digital tool for mapping. And GIS has its roots, interestingly, in military history because it was developed 20 or 30 years ago for surveillance and logistical, as a surveillance and logistical tool, and it's still used by the military. But the cool thing is that today GIS and Esri's related platforms like story maps are now used across fields, so by engineers, by architects, by preservationists, and so we felt that it was a really fitting platform to use to share these stories with you all. And the cool thing too is that this is essentially a living website, so it's something that we can add to and continue to develop as we learn more stories and gather more information and it's something that is publicly accessible. So we're excited to have you all as our audience, and we thank you for giving us an opportunity to test out this new platform with you all.
So to start things off, we're going into the Revolutionary War, and we're going to talk about Peter Francisco. Peter Francisco was known as the Virginia Hercules, or as Washington's, quote, one-man army. And the really interesting part about Peter Francisco is he was found at the age of 5 years old in the year 1765 on the docks of City Point, abandoned. And there are a couple different theories concerning how he was found or why he got to America. One of them being that he was abducted and tried to be sold for ransom back to the family. He was from Portugal. He was from a wealthy family as well. And the second being he was taken to America as an indentured servant for a better life, away from that kind of the things going on with his family. And after he was found on the docks of City Point, he was adopted by a Buckingham County judge who was also the uncle of Patrick Henry. And his name was Anthony Weston, and he raised him until he was 16 years old. And at that point, he joined the Virginia Regiment and fought along with George Washington's Continental Army. He gained legendary status, #1 for his massive size. He grew to 6'8", over 260 pounds, so a giant of a man. And he had multiple different stories of heroism in the battlefield, but one brief story we'd like to tell you is that in the Battle of Camden in South Carolina, he was said to have hoisted an 1,100-pound cannon on his shoulders and hauled it off the battlefield. The cannon was apparently stuck in mud, and none of the other patriots could carry it out, but lead it to Peter Francisco to keep it from going into the possession of the Redcoats. And just to highlight, George Washington said after the war that, quote, without him, we would have lost 2 crucial battles, perhaps the war, and with it our freedom. And today, 250 years later, Hopewell still honors Peter Francisco with a bust of him in front of the municipal building, and there's a street in the Mansion Hills neighborhood named after Peter Francisco.
So I think it's only appropriate to follow up the incredible story of Peter Francisco with an equally incredible Revolutionary War story, and that is the story of Susanna Bowling, or the girl who saved the Revolutionary War. So Susanna Bowling was born in 1764. This was her family's home, which is referred to sometimes as the Bowling's Plantation, sometimes as Mitchell's, and it was located in what is now Hopewell's Mansion Hills neighborhood. And when Susanna was 16 in 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis and his men arrived at her family's doorstep, and they essentially demanded that they stay the night in quarter at the Bowling's home. And at this time, you really couldn't refuse a request like that. So of course the Bowlings agreed, and this in fact turned out to be a very good thing. So that night, General Cornwallis and his men were at the family's home, and Susanna was tasked with serving them dinner. And while she was serving them, she overheard General Cornwallis talking about his plan to capture General Lafayette, who we know was an important American ally. He was a French general and a trusted officer of George Washington. And so Susanna knew, she was very intelligent, she knew that this would be detrimental to the American war effort, and she decided that she had to go warn General Lafayette. And now we have to remember, this is nighttime, she's 16 years old, and she's got to figure out a way to escape from her house and travel all the way to the halfway house where General Lafayette is temporarily quartered in order to warn him. So fortunately for Susanna, as some of you all might know, her family's home, which we can see here on the map, had a tunnel which ran from the cellar out to their dock on the Appomattox River. So she was able to leave the house without anyone noticing, escape through this tunnel, and when she got to her family's dock, she took a canoe, she paddled across the Appomattox River, as you see there, and at the other side, she borrowed a neighbor's horse and proceeded to ride all the way to the halfway house. Now, in modern times, I calculated that the distance from where her house was in present-day Mansion Hills neighborhood to the halfway house, which is aptly named for its location halfway between Petersburg and Richmond, is about 12 miles. And I made a little loopy, to signify it wouldn't have probably been the easiest of journeys, but she successfully made it to the halfway house all under the cover of night and warned General Lafayette. And because of that, she is now known as the girl who saved the Revolutionary War. And we have a photograph of the halfway house here, which still stands. Many of you might have visited it as the Halfway House restaurant. And I'll let John tell you a little bit more about what happened to the Bowling family's home and also the tunnel.
So in 1925, the home finally burned down, and it was located in the Mansion Hills neighborhood, as Ari mentioned, and I've been trying to find the tunnel that was used. There's a 1942 Hopewell News article written by Judge Thomas Robertson. He was really involved with the WPA Writers Project and with local history. And he includes in this article a story and a lot of information about the home. But I've spoken with a few people that grew up in the neighborhood, and one man that grew up in the house that the tunnel caved in his yard when he was a kid. And so he's pinpointed me to a couple locations. We're in the process of hopefully uncovering this tunnel, and we think that the entrance at the riverbank still stands, so maybe next year we'll have an update on that for you.
We also just wanted to highlight too the book called Susanna's Midnight Ride by Richmond-based author Libby McNamee, who some of you all might have heard before. She's come to speak here, and if you want, the full story and all the detail about Susanna, that's where you'll find it.
So moving into the Civil War, we really wanted to include Weston Manor. We have a couple contemporary photos of Weston Manor here. It's beautifully maintained and has a lot of its original architecture thanks to the historic Hopewell Foundation. It's a very important historic home on the Appomattox River, and it's over 250 years old with quite a few war stories.
Yeah, so we just wanted to take a second to highlight some of the significant things that happened at Weston during the Civil War. So I'll kind of relay those quickly for you all. The first is that it said a cannonball penetrated the ceiling of the home after it was shot through the dining room window. The home also served as headquarters for Union General Philip Sheridan. The home was shelled by a Northern gunboat when crossfire erupted between the Union and Confederate armies. And I think this one's really interesting. It said that one of the windows, which I believe is no longer in the home, was signed by Union soldiers. So they etched their names into one of the glass panes. And then I thought this was funny too. I was going back and looking at some of the older pamphlets which relay the Weston history, and one of them talked about how after the war the home's doors were reconfigured to hang from the left side because it was thought that left-hanging doors would, quote, drive out evil spirits and ghosts, which I guess would have been plentiful after the Civil War. And I don't know why it was left-hanging doors that did this, but I guess they just wanted to be safe. So we have a comparison here we wanted to show you all. I know John mentioned how beautifully preserved Weston is, and I think this side-by-side tool, which is a cool feature of story maps, really shows that so nicely. So I'll try to swipe for you all. We have a Civil War era photo to the left here, and that is juxtaposed with this contemporary photo of Weston to the right. So you can see how little has changed over the years thanks to good preservation work.
So now we're still in the Civil War and we're moving closer to City Point. We have St. John's Episcopal Church, which is located on Cedar Lane, and it also has a lot of war history. It served as a signal station for both the Confederate and Union armies during the war, and this is where commanders would observe field movements of the soldiers in the field and then transfer that information to commanders in the field. So in a very interesting story, I talked about Judge Robertson a few minutes ago, but he, along with Roland Gill, interviewed a former slave of the Epps family, and she remembered that the Yankees came and shelled City Point, and they ran a white flag to the top of the house. And so when they were shelling City Point, Mrs. Epps took Paulina to the basement of St. John's Episcopal Church where they hid from the destruction. And so we thought that's just a really neat story that we had to include. And another interesting thing is it was used as a jail, it was used as a theater, and as a dance hall all during the Civil War.
We also learned that during the war, the church unfortunately was destroyed, but it's got kind of an interesting story to it. So the Union Army was very resourceful, and they actually utilized a lot of the wood from the church. So the church pews, the wood flooring, for construction purposes, for fire making purposes. And while this was, good for them, it was ultimately bad for the church. And so essentially by the end of the war, it was in very poor condition. But there was a U.S. major by the name of Mr. Smith, and he helped facilitate the church's repair after the war, and services did resume just a few years later in 1867. But speaking of Paulina Reverend Epps, who I mentioned was one of the slaves of the Epps family, we have a photo of her here. Hopefully this one will work if we go in on it. But here she is pictured in her old age at Appomattox Manor. She did actually return and worked for the Epps family following the end of the Civil War, and her headstone there is in Appomattox Cemetery, so you can go and see her grave. Or I'm sorry, in St. John's Episcopal Church Cemetery.
So we have a contemporary view of St. John's as you can see it today.
Yeah, no longer the wooden structure from 1864.
And before we pass this, I would like to mention we brought in some of the archives we collected, some images, newspaper clippings, and feel free to come up and look at it after the presentation. So just down the road, General Grant sets up his headquarters in City Point from June 1864 to April 1865. And so we include a timeline just to give you a brief overview. Due to time constraints, we can't give all the information because that would be an entire lecture in and of itself.
Yeah, so here we've got the map with General Grant's headquarters. And again, we just wanted to do one more side-by-side comparison. We thought this one was pretty compelling. This left-hand photo here shows members of General Grant's staff at one of the many cabins at his headquarters. They have lots of different cabins and log structures. And we thought that was a pretty great comparison to see. John, I might get you to give me a hand with this one. Between that and to the right, the contemporary replica of General Grant's cabin, which you can go visit in Appomattox Cemetery.
We're going to quickly refresh this. We also, there are hundreds of photos from the Civil War, especially from City Point, available online. And so something we're planning on doing is, and also when we're talking about DuPont, we'll get to that, but we're going to put in like a link for all the different photos so you can come in and see anything you want to see because they're unlimited.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, I think it's really worth seeing this whole photograph. I find all the Civil War photographs, especially those with General Grant and City Point, really striking.
So on June 15th, General Grant arrives in City Point, and over the next 3 days, they have a Union assault on Petersburg, and the Confederates dug in, fought back fiercely, and Grant determined that the only way they were going to be able to capture Petersburg was through a long-term siege. And so over the next 10 months, they conduct that siege, and it lasts 292 days and is the longest American warfare siege in American warfare history.
So on June 21st, President Lincoln visits City Point for the first time. He arrives aboard the USS Baltimore, and interestingly, he and General Grant ride on horseback to visit troops on the front lines of Petersburg. And at this time, they also visit some of the black troops fighting there. And something that John came across when researching this visit with General Grant and President Lincoln is that it said that Lincoln received, quote, hearty cheers from the black soldiers he visited there. So it's interesting to learn a little bit about the reception he had and what those soldiers in their unique position felt in seeing him visiting.
So we want to share this quote. City Point quickly became the scene of the greatest logistical operation of the Civil War. Railroads, telegraph lines were installed to link the Union armies in the field. It became not only the supply depot of the Army of the Potomac, but the nerve center as well and a massive hospital to boot.
And then on August 9th, we're just going to touch on this more later, but I'll leave you with this. A Confederate Secret Service agent sabotages City Point.
And on March 28, 1865, President Lincoln visits City Point for a second and final time, and a famous painting comes about from this visit.
And then finally, on April 2nd and 3rd, after 10 months of fighting, the Union Army captures Petersburg, and after that, Richmond. And also at this time, General Grant spends his final days in City Point.
And a week later, General Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse, signaling the end of the Civil War. And just about a week after that, President Lincoln is assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C.
I think, too, it's really interesting to note that, in the weeks before his assassination, Lincoln was really spending his final days of his life in City Point.
So we really wanted to include the Depot Field Hospital, and this is a really interesting part of the history of City Point. They had 7 hospitals during the Civil War. This was the largest in City Point, and also the largest of its kind in the United States during the Civil War.
The hospital could treat over 10,000 patients, which is just incredible to think about. And the Depot Field Hospital is really noted for having had a low death rate. It said that only 3% of patients who were in the hospital's care died. And a lot of this, from what I read, is attributed to the overall cleanliness of the hospital. And interestingly, water was pumped from a natural spring on the Appomattox River, and it is kind of thought that this helped keep the patients healthy and the hospital more sterile than other Civil War hospitals at the time. And one of the things John and I really enjoyed and doing a little bit of research about the Depot Field Hospital was learning more about its location. This was something I don't think either of us really realized, so I'll let him tell you about that.
Yeah, so it's really neat, but finding a couple maps and comparing, you can see the shoreline of the Appomattox River. It juts out in a couple places. 1 there, 2 there, 3 there. And when you compare that, and you see the whole hospital depot here, when you compare that to a contemporary photo of John Randolph today, it's nearly in the exact same location. So 160 years later, another hospital is located on the same ground. You can see the first jut, and the second, and the third. So it's almost in the exact same area. And you see a 3% death rate. Hopefully that still is the same, or a little bit better today.
And here is just a great photo from the National Park Service, an illustration showing what the Depot Field Hospital looked like. I think you can really appreciate the scale. I think it's said to have been set on like 200 acres, so a pretty significant plot of land, like John said, similar to that John Randolph has today. So that's a great photo for seeing what that facility looked like.
So on August 9th, 1864, a massive explosion in Rock City Point. 2 powder barges exploded, and it was originally thought to be an accident. They're handling munitions and they're handling guns and weapons and anything that you can think of in wartime. Sadly, 40 people, some sources point to 300, were killed, as well as like 140 wounded. And as I said, they thought it wasn't deliberate, they thought it was an accident. But after the war ended, the United States government took possession of letters and records from the Confederate Army, and they found that a Confederate Secret Service agent named John Maxwell plotted and took 2, quote, horological torpedoes and snuck them onto these boats, which is just a time bomb. And they exploded, and it had massive destruction at the wharf at City Point. But the neatest part about it is it caused $2 to $4 million worth of damage.
Which was back then, right? $2 to $4 million of Civil War money?
I think so.
Yeah.
But the craziest part about it is it only took 9 days to rebuild and become operational again, which just shows the efficiency that Grant and his team were running and the workers down in City Point.
And these are 2 illustrations of the explosion, but both were in newspapers published in 1864. And so I think that really sets the tone for what John was saying about the 9-day rebuilding period. You can tell just in these illustrations alone the kind of devastation that the explosion caused. So next we're moving to Union Fort, and some of you all might be familiar with this history as well. The Union Army designed and constructed 10 small forts at City Point to protect the neighborhood from Confederate invaders. And one of these 10 forts was known as Fort Abbott. And for many decades, the fort shown here in this map to the left was thought to be Fort Abbott, and it was identified as the city's only surviving Civil War fort. But in recent years, the fort was renamed after it was discovered that its location actually didn't match up with the location of Fort Abbott as it was seen in Civil War era maps. And it was interesting for John and me because neither of us realized that Fort Abbott had been renamed and that this had already been discovered. So we sort of had this process of discovering it on our own. John had been looking at these Civil War maps and he had realized, wait a minute, Fort Abbott and where they're saying Fort Abbott is don't line up.
Yeah, so thanks to Jeannie Langford back there, our local hero, the historian at the library. I spoke to Jeannie, and She told me that Jimmy Blankenship had figured this out years ago and gotten the city to finally change Fort Abbott to Union Fort. So we're trying to map out the original location of Fort Abbott. We believe it is in a wooded area, potentially could have already been developed over near 21st Avenue. So with some mapping work, with hopefully the city, we can find this place, and hopefully, fingers crossed, there's some breastworks still down there.
I think too, also the question remains, what is the history of what is now referred to as Union Fort? So I think there's more to be done in figuring that out as well.
And before we go, these maps were done in 1867 by a Union cartographer, and you can see here again the Depot Field Hospital, Weston Manor, and Fort Abbott. And then again over here, where we think this is where the Union Fort is. There are trenches and such, and then some other breastworks there protecting City Point.
And then we just wanted to include a few contemporary photos of course, again, what is now known as Union Fort on Appomattox Street in City Point.
So we want to go into the Peacemakers. This is a painting that was done following Lincoln's second visit to City Point in 1865. But on this visit, he met aboard the ship with General Sherman, General Grant, President Lincoln, and Admiral David Porter. And they met and discussed the terms of peace for the impending Confederate surrender. And the really neat thing is this is exactly where they discussed, Lincoln wanted liberal terms for the Confederacy to surrender. They wanted automatic citizenship back into the United States. And so these conversations that led us to the country we have today took place on the banks of City Point, on the banks of Hopewell, and right on in our river.
And the story of the Peacemakers painting itself is also very interesting. So the painting was done in 1868 by American portrait painter George Healy, and it was destroyed in a fire in 1893. But it was discovered that a second, albeit smaller version of the painting by Healy had been made. He'd actually gifted this second smaller version to a friend, and that was discovered in Chicago in the 1920s. And that painting, that second painting, has had a pretty cool history in that it's now in the private dining room of the Oval Office in the White House.
Yeah, so this is such a special find for us. Living in Hopewell, growing up here my whole life, I'm always told, what's the Hopewell connection? Everybody's so proud of our small town's connection around the world, and the connection that we found was this painting hangs in the Oval Office private dining room in the White House. And you can see here President Obama dining with the Peacemakers, President Bush posing with the Peacemakers, and then President Reagan and Vice President Bush with their staff with the Peacemakers as well. So it's just a really neat connection. So we're moving into the Spanish-American War, and we want to recognize two Medal of Honor recipients from Hopewell. The first being Robert Penn. He was born in City Point on October 10, 1872, and in 1898 he won the Medal of Honor. He has a very great story. He was a field hand in City Point, and he joined the Navy, saying for, quote, a better life. And I'm going to share his story word for word just to help you better understand exactly what he did. So while Penn was serving as a fireman first class on the USS Iowa off the coast of Cuba, a boiler accident occurred aboard the ship. The accident caused a manhole gasket to blow off one of the boilers, filling the room with scalding water. According to the book Deeds of Valor, Penn entered the room number 2 just in time to save an injured coal passer from falling into the boiling water which covered the floor. He carried the man who had both feet scalded and a wound on his forehead to a safe place and then ran back. After saving this man, Penn heroically went back into the room which had caught fire and was at risk of exploding. Using a plank and coal buckets, he built a makeshift bridge, allowing him to cross over the scalding water and shut off the boiler, effectively putting out the fire. He saved the ship from a large explosion and the lives of his fellow mates and received the Medal of Honor for his actions.
And something we wanted to highlight about Robert Penn is that he was one of just 6 African-American men who received the Medal of Honor in the Spanish-American War. And interestingly, he was the only African-American man of those 6 who was not part of the Buffalo Soldiers or the 10th Cavalry Regiment, which was the all-black regiment in the Spanish-American War. And I also learned in reading that he was the only black sailor aboard the USS Iowa.
Yeah, and he was also, it's kind of neat, there was the second one of the Buffalo Soldiers, the Black Buffalo Soldiers that won the Medal of Honor, was from Dinwiddie County. So 2 in the local area. And secondly, you know, as we all know, in that time period, black soldiers weren't as freely awarded prestigious military honors. And so it just goes to show how heroic he was, even in the 1890s, to be awarded the Medal of Honor.
Yeah, and we wanted to point out, this is an illustration of Penn in the Boiler Room. Then that middle image is his headstone. He's buried in the Delaware County, in the Eden Cemetery in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. And then John can tell you a little bit about that right hand.
And the last thing, it's super neat, you know, 1970, they commemorated Robert Penn, the Navy did. And so, you know, 90 years after his actions, he's still remembered. So again, it just shows the magnitude of his courageous actions that day. Our second Medal of Honor recipient is George Bright. He was a coal passenger aboard the USS Nashville and was awarded the Medal of Honor for heroism and gallantry under fire of enemy. We're seeking additional information. You know, if anybody has any information about him or family members, we'd really love to, you know, get something documented about him, because we've found only one clipping in the Hopewell News about this man, and I just don't think that's fair for a Medal of Honor recipient. So we're moving into World War I, and we just wanted to include this photo of the World War I soldiers marching from Fort Lee down Brickety Hill in City Point. This is Pecan Avenue now. And they're marching off to war and boarding a ship at the docks at City Point.
Something that I love about this photo too is I think it sort of speaks to this idea of, you know, the multi-generational nature of war. And we think about all of the Civil War history that was happening in this same area of City Point years before, and now, you know, we have soldiers moving down this same ground, walking down Brickety Hill to board ships and be taken abroad to fight. And I just thought that was something really compelling about this image. Oops, sorry.
So moving forward, we're in World War I, and this is the home front. You know, we see soldiers marching off to war, and then what's going on here? Well, DuPont purchases over 2,000 acres of farmland in 2 separate purchases, one for a dynamite factory in 1912, and the second purchase to build the largest gun cotton manufacturing facility in the world. And they did that. They employed over 28,000 workers from all over the world, and also from West Virginia, North Carolina. And what's interesting is Ari and I, both of our great-grandfathers, came here for work at this factory. So it's really neat. And they produced over 1.5 billion pounds of gun cotton and sent it to the front lines during World War I.
We have a postcard here showing the entrance to the gun cotton factory, and then another here as well, which is cool because it has a message on the back, which is kind of describing the scene. But this one's interesting. You can see everyone lining up for work at the plant.
So we have a headline from the New York Times just showing the significance of this plant transforming this tiny little city of Hopewell. And then we have to the left a book that was published by DuPont after the war, after the armistice was signed, and they titled it "America's Greatest Industrial Opportunity, Hopewell, Virginia." I think that could still be used today. I think that could be pitched by our city, but maybe we can do that in the future. And something very neat that I found years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. You know, we love driving around town with our friends, finding neat stuff, and we found these ruins, these concrete columns, the leftover base of a powerhouse that was operated by DuPont during World War I. And as you can see on the left, we were going through this book a couple weeks ago, and I was like, holy cow, this is exactly what I've been seeing and I've taken pictures of and wondered for 4 years what it is. So it's a really neat discovery that we had during this research.
Yeah, and we have one more kind of back and forth slide comparison, and this one is just crazy to me. So, like John said, he found these ruins and he had taken me to see them, and you know, we were aware that they were something DuPont, you know, World War I related, but you know, had no idea what the structure was. So this photo was taken a few years ago, and when we put it into story maps side by side, it was a perfect match with this photo from the book. And again, we had no idea what the structure was, so it's not like we were trying to line the two up when we took the photo. So it just felt like this perfect serendipitous moment when we saw old and new coming together in this comparison. And we'll finish off with, again, a couple photos from a few years back in 2020. This is when I first went to see the ruins, and there in the bottom left, if that gives you any indication of scale. So pretty magnificent ruins that remain there. And our last World War I story is a great one. It actually relates to how Hopewell's mascot came to be. And so this is the story of the French Blue Devils.
The Les Diables Bleus.
I don't think John was very good at French, no offense. But anyway, the French Blue Devils were a group of elite soldiers, and they were known for their very unique training. You see them in these different illustrations here. And they were especially recognized for their alpine knowledge that had been used to break the stalemate of trench warfare in the French Alps. But they were also sort of beloved for their look. You can see they have the blue beret, and they have the flowing cape and mustaches. They're, a charming, sort of alluring group. And interestingly, these soldiers came to the United States and trained some of our soldiers here. And I'll let John tell you more about that.
Yeah, so during World War I, they were extremely, they were the badasses of the French army. They came to Fort Lee during World War I and trained, 200 of them came and trained with the soldiers at Fort Lee in bayonet warfare. And they also marched the country touring, trying to raise money for the war efforts, which is just really neat. And in the late 20s, the Hopewell High School faculty and staff chose to honor these French Blue Devils by making them our mascot.
So of course we see the mascot as we know it today, and then as John mentioned, we have a news clipping from 1952 talking about the French Blue Devils coming to Camp Lee and training the soldiers in bayonet warfare. So that brings us to World War II, and we felt that it was really appropriate to start by talking about the Hopewell News and all of this. It will be linking a lot of things in the next few stories that we shared, but something cool that John told me about was that the Hopewell News provided discounted newspaper rates, and they actually sent copies of the Hopewell News to soldiers overseas. And so, this was a great thing that they were doing, a great service that they had, because soldiers were able to keep up with local news about the war, and they were also able to keep up with one another, as John will show you in some of these newspaper clippings. And something that we loved in looking through all the newspaper archives was seeing that this service really, it didn't go unrecognized. Soldiers were writing to the news staff, and they were writing home, expressing their gratitude, for all the work that the Hopewell News was doing for them. And they were also writing home, talking about how excited they were to see their hometown friends and know their hometown friends were nearby. And they spoke very fondly about the different reunions that they were able to have with one another thanks to the work of the Hopewell News.
And so you'll see in some of the clippings, Lieutenant Colonel Ruffin meets Hopewell boys and, quote, had a big time talking about Hopewell. George ran into a number of Hopewell boys while he was overseas. And then we have 3 of them where he says, there must be about 20 boys from Hopewell down here. Just really neat to see this. There are hundreds and hundreds of occurrences like this in the Hopewell News during wartime editions. And it wasn't an unusual occurrence. Every single one you look at, they're running into each other and they're so happy, and it just shows that community spirit, that community connection that these guys had.
Yeah, we're going to keep hearing about these reunions all through World War II, and we really can learn about them in looking at the Matsuk family. This was another story that I was so taken with. So the Matsuks, they were Sammy and Louise. They were a couple. They were originally from Hopewell. You can see a photograph of Mrs. Matsuk in her 1938 Hopewell High School yearbook. And they were from Hopewell, but they moved to Hawaii during World War II to work in the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. And what's so amazing about them is that they opened their home to any soldiers who were stationed in the area. And so they came to host all of these Hopewell soldiers while they were living in Hawaii.
So we have a letter from 1945 from Mrs. Matsuk to the Hopewell News, and we're going to share a few things. Basically, she was telling of the men that have come and visited and their new address, because they don't want any Hopewell boys to miss them if they come overseas. I wanted to mark a few things. She starts off by saying, when I wrote to you last fall, we had only 22 visitors. You may add 20 more now and make the grand total 42. She then goes and shows all the names of the soldiers that have come to visit, including Reed Rickman, Hardway Marks, plenty of people that I'm sure many of you know. And she then goes on saying that Clinton Steele and Tennessee Riggin were killed in action following their visit. But she concluded that by saying we're glad they were able to give them a, quote, home away from home for a short time at least. And she tells a story saying our home has been a meeting place for quite a few old friends from our Wonder City. A typical incident took place a short while ago. Sammy was at home rather early in the morning when Reed Rickman stopped by. About 10 minutes later, Ray Taylor came in. The two used to work together at the fire department and had not seen each other in years. Sammy says that they fell all over each other trying to shake hands and hug at the same time. And she also adds to be sure to let the fellas know our new address. We wouldn't want to miss seeing any of them due to a change in address. And she concludes saying, to the boys in this area now, and to the ones that may be here later, don't forget to stop by. You are always welcome. Thanks to you, Mr. Robbins, for such a wonderful paper. It always makes us feel so much closer to you folks back there. They ended up hosting over 55 Hopewell soldiers during World War II.
And we wanted to leave you with one really funny Matzik story that was in the Hopewell News. So it's talking about one of the soldiers who was staying with them, and I think it just really reflects the Matzik's hospitality, but also the level of comfort these men had in staying with them. So it says, M.L. Price, who was the soldier, came early in the afternoon. Finding no one at home, he proceeded to put a chicken on the stove and had dinner half done when Louise and Sammy came home from work. So I love that mental image. Just amazing stories like that.
So we're moving on to Calvin and Harp Jr. He was a Silver Star recipient, and he was sadly killed in action. He was awarded the Silver Star posthumously. Here's a picture of him in the class of 1940 Hopewell High School yearbook. He's a senior, and he was one of 6 Hopewell class of 1940 graduates that were killed in action during World War II. The Silver Star is the 3rd highest military combat decoration that can be awarded to American soldiers. And I want to share a couple of I want to read exactly what he did, just to give you a better idea. When his platoon was fired upon by enemy mortars and machine guns, Lieutenant Harp crawled forward under heavy enemy fire and succeeded in killing the personnel of one machine gun position with rifle grenades. In an attempt to eliminate a second emplacement, he stepped on an anti-personnel mine, blowing off his foot. Although fatally wounded, he managed to launch another grenade, stunning the enemy and enabling his platoon to assault and destroy the position. Just a very sad story, but just highlights his heroism and his bravery.
And we wanted to include as well the 1939 Hopewell High School football program. Calvin Harp was on the football team. You can see him in red here. He was number 80, and he was killed at such a young age. We don't have a lot of information about his life, but it was important to us to think about some of the things he was involved with prior to going to war. And that brings us to the Rickman family. This is another really amazing World War II family that we wanted to spend some time talking about. So the Rickmans were a family from Hopewell who had 9 children. They were Mr. William Rickman and Mrs. Ada Rickman, and they had 7 sons and 2 daughters. And 6 of their 7 sons served in World War II. One of them, Reed, stayed with the Matzuks. And we want to talk a little bit more about each of them individually. But first, I wanted to take a moment to talk about Mrs. Rickman. She really was an amazing woman. She was 19. The Virginia Mother. She won the Virginia War Mother of the Year award in 1942 for her dedication and involvement in assisting with overseas war efforts. And she's quoted here in red as saying, "My only regret is that I do not have 6 more boys like them to serve, 6 more to help bring peace to this war-torn world." So I think that quote really speaks to what kind of woman she was and what kind of mother she was, and an American as well. And now I'll tell you a little bit about each of her 6 sons who served.
So the first son we wanted to talk about is George Rickman. We have a quote we got from the Hopewell News where it says, "George Thomas Rickman was a war hero who came home to a life of community service in Hopewell 42 years ago." And we want to explain a couple of things that he did in the war. Rickman served in both the Pacific and European theaters and was wounded twice in the Pacific. He flew on B-26s when they had no tail guns and were easy prey when the Japanese attacked from the rear. His bomber belly landed in Australia after being shot up. That experience prompted Rickman and fellow crew members to urge modifications of the B-26s. They suggested that the tail section be sawed off and an Army 50 caliber machine gun mounted inside. The military followed it, and on his first bombing raid after the change, Rickman shot down 3 Zeros. The next day he shot down 2 more, making him an ace. He added another war-related distinction, membership in the Caterpillar Club, which is open only to those that have had to parachute from a crippled plane. He shooted over the Owen Stanley Mountains of New Guinea and wandered for 8 days without food. He finally found natives, and they were friendly, and they organized a safari taking Rickman to the coast where he was able to arrange transportation to Australia. After 113 bombing raids in the Pacific Theater, he was transferred to Europe, and from his base in Italy, he flew 51 missions against German and European cities. And on 2 of those missions, his plane lost an engine but returned safely. During a bombing raid on Toulon, France, Rickman risked his life to save that of a wounded fellow crewman. And for his bravery, he received the Distinguished Flying Cross.
Lots of information from the Hopewell News that you can go back and read if you wish.
So this is just one of the craziest and coolest stories I think we found. Gilbert Rickman, another son, served as a merchant marine, and on 3 separate occasions his ship was torpedoed. 2 in the Atlantic and 1 in the Gulf of Mexico. And in each disaster he was rescued, but in one, a Hopewell man named George Stark pulled him to safety. And one of his family members quoted saying, "One of the rescuers was from Hopewell and pulled Uncle Gilbert into the lifeboat. And when he saw who it was, said, 'Damn, Rickman, if I knew who it was, I would have let you drown.'"
The reunions don't stop. And that brings us to the 3rd brother, Joseph Rickman. Joseph served in the Army. He was the recipient of several different awards. He won the Purple Heart. He was awarded the Silver Star after he and a fellow soldier snuck behind enemy lines and captured 13 German soldiers. After that, he earned the Bronze Star after he carried one of his men who had been injured in a minefield explosion around a mountain in northern Italy to the nearest hospital. And then just the craziest story of all about Joseph Rickman is that he and his infantry were the ones who found the body of Mussolini and his mistress hanging in the downtown square of Milan. And so Mussolini and his mistress, they had been executed a few days prior by a firing squad, and they had been hung by their heels in this downtown square. And they'd been hanging there for a few days at this point when they were found, and their bodies were beaten. And Joseph and his infantry were tasked with guarding the bodies until they could be removed. So it said that they had to fire their guns into the air to get everyone to disperse, and they had to stand and guard the bodies. I'm not sure exactly for how long. And something else amazing about this is that it's said that Joseph, within his collection of items from the war, actually had a photograph of the bodies.
So the next son is Earl Rickman, and he was served as a merchant marine, and he had quite a few experiences, but one, he was on a Liberty ship when a torpedo was shot at the ship, and they had this new technology where torpedoes, kind of anti-torpedo, they saw them coming and exploded them before they hit the ship. And so the ship obviously still rocked, and so he got stuck in between a sea bin and had to get out, but just a very interesting experience that Earl Rickman had.
And that brings us to Reed Rickman, who again was one of the Hopewell soldiers who stayed with the Matsukes. But Reed was part of the Navy, and he was in 3 different invasions, 2 in Italy and 1 in France. And during these invasions, his battalion experienced over 100 air raids conducted by the Axis powers. And one story that, I'll scroll down a little bit so you all can see, we have Boston here in red, again from the Hopewell News, is just about another crazy reunion. So at this point, Reed is in North Africa. He's at a Red Cross facility in between invasions, and he's there and he feels a hand on his shoulder and he hears a man's voice say, "Are you from Hopewell, Virginia?" And so Reed turns around, he looks at the man, and there's Williard Patton, a fellow Hopewell man and soldier who's also in North Africa ahead of an impending invasion.
So the last son that we're going to highlight is David Stanley Rickman. He served in 2 famous fighting divisions, the 29th Infantry Division and the 5th Red Devil Division. Sadly, he was killed in November of 1944. during the Great Push through France. You know, it was a few months after D-Day, and they were pushing through France, trying to get closer to Germany. And he was killed in action, and he today rests in City Point National Cemetery in Hopewell. I would like to also note that he was the youngest of the 9 children, or the youngest of the 7 sons, one of those. But Mrs. Rickman also lost her eldest son, Billy Rickman, in 1944 as well. So she had 5 soldiers out at sea and all over the world, and 2 sons killed in 1944. So you can only imagine the tragedy and how she felt. So we're wrapping up our presentation with a couple of stories. This one is very personal to me. I'm sure many of you know Tom Blunt and Jimmy Vergara. They were both long-time Hopewell men, born and raised here. And Tom Blunt I sat with him and got to know him a little bit in his later years of life, and he told me lots of different stories, but one of them was really neat. He was in Iwo Jima, outside of his tent near an airstrip, and he hears a man flying down the airstrip in a car with his head out the window shouting, "Is there anybody here from Hopewell, Virginia? Is there anybody here from Hopewell, Virginia?" He's shouting, and Tom, he's just like, "Who is this guy?" And so they catch up, they talk, and I asked him, I said, "Mr. Blunt, you know, were other people riding around shouting, looking for people from their hometown?" He's like, "No, just Jimmy." And so I asked him his reactions, and of course he laughed aloud, and he said, you know, it was just really neat meeting someone, you know, from Hopewell, so far away from home.
Yeah, and so both men, as we know, survived the war and returned home to Hopewell. And something that I thought was really cool was that Mr. Blunt, who you see here on the left, actually he was mayor in the early 1980s, and he served alongside Jimmy Vergara's son, Jimmy Vergara Jr., who you see here in the middle, who was on city council at the time. So again, kind of thinking about that multi-generational, effect of war, just to think that Tom Blunt and Jim Vergara Sr. were meeting in Iwo Jima, and then years later, Tom Blunt is serving with Jim's son here in Hopewell, is amazing to think about. And I just want to kind of hone it in again, the distance and just magnitude of these sorts of meetings. You start to feel like more soldiers from Hopewell were seeing each other outside of Hopewell than they were in Hopewell. But the distance from Iwo Jima to Hopewell is 7,463 miles. So if that's not all the way across the world, then I'm not sure what is.
So we want to talk about 3 men from Hopewell and 2 men from Hopewell and 1 from Prince George. These men were killed on D-Day, and from the left to the right we have Thomas Reed, Harry Rust, and Edward Vargo. Thomas Reed was from Hopewell. Here's an image of him. He was, again, in the class of 1940. He was one of the 6 men killed, and here's a wartime photo. He grew up lived on North 9th Avenue and was 24 years old when he was killed. Harry Rust grew up on North 4th Avenue, and he was 26 years old when he was killed. We haven't found any family information about Harry Rust. We found his grave after searching for about 1 hour in Appomattox Cemetery. Then we found his grave and cleaned up the edges a little bit, so it looks good, but hopefully we can connect with the family member here soon. Going back to Mr. Reed, we connected with his nephew, who lives in Chesterfield County, and he was supposed to be here today. He has some memories from his father, telling some stories about his uncle.
So hopefully, we can hear and learn more about Thomas Reed, as well as Ed Vargo and Harry Rust. And we have a story that's all connected to these 3 men and the events on D-Day. And we're going to play a recording for you all, but just to give you some context, this was another story that John learned firsthand from Dr. Fujimori, who many of you all knew, Hopewell native and also a Korean War veteran. And he told John this story about that had been relayed to him by another Hopewell man named Raymond Garrett about Mr. Garrett's experiences landing on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. So we'll play this clip for you. We've got a speaker, and we hope you all can hear it in the back. Oh, I think we need to turn that on. if it weren't so compelling, we'd just tell it to you.
Yeah.
But hearing Dr. Moore speak about it is really worth listening to. Oh my gosh.
Okay. Yeah, we're not the best with technology, but.
All right. Well, maybe we can play it afterward, but we'll continue on. John, why don't you summarize what he was saying while I get us back to.
So, Dr. Moore, I interviewed him about 1 year before he passed away, and he explained this story about Raymond Garrett, who was another Hopewell man, and he was on the beaches of D-Day. He was a part of the first wave, and he said that the first man he saw lying dead on the beaches was a Hopewell man. And so, following the interview, I was interested, and I looked up Raymond Garrett's obituary, and the interview, Dr. Moore says that he must have been in the National Guard. And so the two Hopewell men that were killed, one of them, Harry Rust, was in fact in the National Guard prior to his service and worked at DuPont. So it's just, really a tragic story, but an amazing encounter, seeing that, I don't know, it's just amazing. We really just wanted to share that with you all.
And we wanted to end just by taking a second to talk about Hopewell's War Memorial and then also the City Point National Cemetery. So, oh gosh, our photos might not want to load. But that photo, hopefully you got a glimpse of it, on the left was from 1921 from when the War Memorial was dedicated. And interestingly, it was actually the first World War I memorial dedicated in Virginia. And then we have a contemporary picture on the right. And John knows some interesting history about the monument itself.
Yeah, so thanks to Dave Harless, he kind of shared this information with me, but it's Vermont granite that the stone was made, or that the monument was constructed with, and it was the only material that could withstand the acidity and the emissions from the DuPont gun factory. So it's a little scary, but we got a lot of people here that lived for a super long time, so maybe it's a secret.
And then here we have some photos of the City Point National Cemetery on Memorial Avenue. There are over 6,800 soldiers buried there, 5,000 of whom died in the Civil War. And this cemetery was established in 1866. And so we'll leave you with two maps. The first here is sort of a populated map of all of the different sites in Hopewell that we talked about. And again, this is something we want to continue to add to, more pinpoints and markers of things that you can go see and visit here in Hopewell. And then finally, we have a map showing kind of the significant Hopewell war-related histories that took place all over the world. And I think this just, visually illustrates how Hopewell's war history is by no means confined to the geographic bounds of the city, but really is global, and that is something that's incredible.
And to add to that, like we said, it's just a small portion, and there's so many more stories. Broadway Landing, the Lusitania has Hopewell connection. There's a laundry list of stories that we're hoping to get into and present to people because they just are significant. Hopewell, our history is so rich, and these are the men and women that sacrificed so greatly for our country and gave so much to our country. And we live on sacred ground. This ground has been walked by some of the most influential people in American history, and so I just think that it's extremely special and makes this community one of a kind. Thank you.
Thank you.